Hello, everyone, and welcome to this talk on called Electrify Your Flow Screen with Aura and Lightning Web Components. My name's Oliver Scofield. I'm the Salesforce architect at the National Audit Office. And thanks just for taking a moment to choosing this session to watch today. Without further ado, we're just going to get into it. So what we're going to be doing in this talk is we're going to have a walkthrough of our flow and components. We have a set of flow screens that we're going to have a look at, see how these are configured with their components in the builder, and look at some code highlights and some differences between the Aura and the Lightning Web component versions. So let's quickly move to our flow screen. Let me just move the camera out of the way so I can see the next button. So you can see that this is a standard flow screen. We've not added anything to it. So essentially all we have at the start of our flow is the next button. Again, this is another standard flow screen. We have our content of our flow screen, and now we have a previous and a next button. And you can see that they're both over on the right-hand side. When we move to our next screen, you can see that we've starting to add some Lightning components to our content. We've now taken control of the navigation, including moving the back button or the previous button to the left-hand side, and we've also changed the labels of the buttons. Moving forward, we can see that we have a Lightning Web component version with controlling the navigation. Here we've added some other details to the some icons to the buttons. Here we have an Aura-based budget profile. We'll talk through the budget profile a little later on. And of course, we have a Lightning Web component version of this as well. So before we start to look at some of the code of how these are put together, it's probably a good idea to have a look at the flow builder itself. So what we'll do is we'll take one of these screens and we'll just talk through essentially what's happening on this screen and what we need to configure our components. In the center of the screen, we have a canvas, and this is a drag and drop area where we can drop our components in. We have our standard components for input and display, and we have custom components that we've added, and these can be dragged and dropped onto the canvas in the center. On this side of the screen, we've got our screen properties. We need to give the screen a label and an API name. We can give it a description as well. And we can configure the frame. So at the moment, we're showing the header. We can remove the header. We can also show or hide the footer. Of course, we don't need the footer because our footer is being controlled by our component here. The navigation is controlled from here. So essentially, these are the actions which are made available to this screen. So either have next or finish, previous, and pause. Pause is actually disabled in this org, so we won't see any pause buttons. So that's how obviously some of the standard native functionality for the flow screen is put together. If we look at our flow footer component, again, we need to give it an API name. We have some variables that the component requires. So these essentially are the labels that we showed in the flow screen. We can also set component visibility, and we've set this to always visible. If the component had any outputs, so for instance, our budget profile might have output values, we can assign those values to variables within the flow, and then the flow can continue to use those variables. So that's essentially how the configuration for the flow itself works. Let's dive in and let's look at some of the code to see how it's possible that we can add our components to our flow screens. Okay, let's quickly move over to our flow footer, which is an Aura component. You can see at the top of the page, or at the top of the code here, we have the interface, implements Lightning for flow screens. This is required, obviously, to make it available to the flow. You can see we have our Aura attributes here. We have some Boolean values, and these are corresponding to the actions that are available in the flow. So can it pause, can it go backwards, forwards, can it finish? We also have the attributes for our labels, and these in order to get these attributes exposed to the flow, they need to be also referenced in our design file. The design file, the name of the design attribute needs to correspond to the attribute that's in the component file. Looking further down, we can also see that we have our init handler, and this is going to fire when our component loads. If we look at the controller, we can see how this is operating. So it takes a parameter of the component, and we're doing a component.get on something called v.availableActions. Now, if you remember when we were looking at the component file, there isn't an attribute called availableActions. This is implicitly added by virtue of the available for flow screens interface. Once we've got hold of those available actions, we can then loop through the available actions and check whether we can do certain actions. So the first if statement, we're looking to see if we can pause, and if we can pause, then we will set our attribute to true. When that attribute is true, obviously, then we're going to show the corresponding button to the user. If we flip to the component file again, you can see this is an Aura if statement surrounding. So when the can back button is true, it will show the back button, and we'll be able to move backwards in the flow. Below our init handler, we have our on button pressed function. This is essentially what's going to happen when the user clicks on the button within the component. Here we have two parameters that we are taking into the function. We have the component and the event. So the firstly, we are using the event, and we're getting hold of the local ID. The local ID in our case is going to be, let's have a look at the button. So the local ID in our case is going to be the Aura ID. And here, obviously, it needs to reference the action that we're going to perform. So, and it needs to be in the capital letters. So we get our Aura ID, our local ID, and then we're going to pass that into another implicit attribute from the interface, navigate flow. Once we have those two elements, we're then able to fire that event, and then we're going to move forward or backwards or pause or finish, depending on which action that's going to take. So let's quickly look now at some of the differences that we might see if we were to create a Lightning Web Component version of this. So this is a flow footer Lightning Web Component, and this is the HTML file. So here we can see the markup. Obviously, it's a Lightning Web Component. There are no attributes here. being declared. There are no interfaces that are added in this file. This is simply our markup. We are still using our can back or can next, can pause in our markup, but they behave slightly differently. So let's have a look at the JavaScript file. Okay, so instead of an interface, an interface for the Lightning Web Component version, we're importing these navigation events. And we import the navigation events from something called Lightning Flow Support. Once we have we've imported these, obviously we can then use them within our JavaScript file. You can see we still have something called available actions. It's no longer an attribute; it's now a property, and it's explicit. We need to explicitly add this to the file. So we need to add this, and it's a public property, so specified by the app API declaration. So we also have our label attributes. These are now public properties. And we have our Boolean attributes, and these are private properties. Instead of our init handler, we have a connected callback, which is going to run when the component loads. And again, it is doing a similar job to our init handler in the Aura component. We are looping through the available actions. And again, if the action is available to us, if it's been set, configured from the flow screen, then we will set the property to true this time, and the button again will be shown to the user. Scrolling down a little bit, we can see our functions that are going to be run when we click these buttons. You can see that these are running in a slightly different way. So there are no parameters passed into this function. We actually have a function for each of our buttons. And again, we are now sort of looping through the available actions. And if it finds in this case, the next action, then it will say, right, okay, we're able to perform that action. So it's doing a little bit of additional validation for you. Obviously, you would need to ensure that you wire the correct function to the correct button. And then, of course, we are declaring our next event, and then we dispatch that event. So you can see the other functions here. I did have a look at seeing if you could write a single function. You could alternatively do something like this, where you pass the event into the function. Then, of course, we're using event.target.name, which in this case would need to match the action. And in this case, the if statement that we've written here, if it matches next, then it's going to perform the same trick. It's going to see, right, is next available in my available actions, and if it is, then we will set up our navigation event and dispatch that event. Okay, so we've looked a little bit of the detail in the code. So we're going to move back to the slides and just recap on these various bits. Okay, so we looked at how we need to assign the flow variables to either a component attribute or a property. And the flow is essentially going to control how the inputs and the outputs work with the component. In terms of interfaces, for our Aura component, we need to use Lightning Available for flow screens, and this lives in the component file. The Lightning Web components, what we're doing here is we're importing the navigation events. You can also see there's a different event there, which we'll talk in a little bit later. The flow attribute change events, and these are from Lightning Flow Support. once we have those within our files, we can then start to expose our attributes or properties to our flow. So in terms of the aura component, we need to represent these in the design file. And for the Lightning Web component, we need to put these in the JS Meta XML file. I've just realized that I haven't actually shown you the JS Meta file. We'll come back. So here's the JS Meta file. We can give the component a name, and this is the name that will appear in the list of components. We need to specify where it's going to live. So it's going to live on a flow screen. So we need Lightning _flow screen as our target. And then we have our config targets. So essentially we are exposing the properties to the flow. And we can even set defaults. Okay, back to the slides. Taking control of the navigation essentially involves looking at or working with the available actions. For the aura component, these are implicitly added attributes, and then obviously we take control of those within the JavaScript controller. For the Lightning Web component, this has to be a public property which is explicitly added to the JavaScript file. For our buttons and events, here obviously we have some differences in how the markup is put together. The aura component has an aura ID, which is used in the onClick function, whereas the Lightning Web component doesn't necessarily need to have the name referencing the action that we're going to fire, unless of course you want to handle it in the second example that we showed, where we were passing the event into the function. Okay, right, now we're going to have a closer look at the budget profile. So we're just going to remind ourselves as to how that looks. Okay, so this is the aura version of our budget profile component. The use case for this is essentially that a user is required to provide a budget amount that they're going to spend in any given year. But they also need to say how much of that budget they're going to spend in the corresponding months for that year. So you can see immediately as I start entering in these values, you can see that the component begins to give us a little bit of information and changes. So at the moment, we have our profile amount, the sum of all the values for each month, doesn't match our budget amount. So there's a couple of things that have happened. We have a red cross over here to say that they don't match, and we've disabled the next button so they can't move forward. So we have some validation going on there. When the values do match, we get a nice green tick, and then we have and our button is no longer disabled. So let's dive back to the slides, and let's just have a quick run through as to how those mismatched totals are working. In the aura world, we are using an aura if, and obviously when we are adding up the profile and comparing it to our budget total, we are setting the matched attribute to true. If it's true, then obviously it will show us our green tick, and if it's not, then the else statement will run and it will show us our red cross. For our Lightning Web component, we don't have aura if, we have if false or if true. And here, obviously, we're doing much the same thing. We're setting this property to true or false, depending on whether they match. and if it's if it doesn't match, then obviously we're going to show a red cross, and if we do have a match of the profile and the budget amount, then we will see our nice green tick. Disabling the button, like again, in the Aura world, we are using an expression whether the matched is false, and if the match is false, then it's going to disable the button. For the lightning component, we just need to reference the is not matched private property, and if that is true, then it will disable the button. Okay, now we come to understanding some of the differences between Aura and Lightning components in the way that they you do their data binding. So for an Aura component, we have a bi-directional data bind. What that means is that when our flow is, in this case, our parent would be our flow. When the flow is setting values on the component, when the user then changes those values, when they're interacting with the component, the flow will know about it because the direction, the data is bi-directionally bound. However, when you are using a Lightning Web component, the binding will follow the hierarchy. So in our case, the parent, the flow, will set the component, but then when we change the value on that component, the flow is not necessarily going to know about it straight away. What we need to do is we need to fire an event, and this is the event that we need to fire. We talked about this a little earlier. It's another one of these events that we need to import from Lightning Flow Support. And this is how it works. Essentially, it requires a couple of parameters for the property that has changed and the value that it has changed to. Once we have those, we can then dispatch that event quite happily. And then the flow knows that the value has changed. The flow can then proceed, and it has the correct values in its flow variables. That's not the end of the story for the parent and child binding. However, we also need to handle changing values from the base components. On our budget profile, every one of the monthly inputs is using a base component, and when that changes, obviously the same principle applies, and we need to tell the parent that the child has changed one of the values. Now, when I first was looking at this, I felt this was a bit crazy, and I thought, well, goodness, what am I going to do? Am I going to need an event handler for every single one of these inputs? Fortunately, that's not the case. I don't even need to use a switch statement inside our function. We can solve it with a single line of code. So we have our handle change function. We pass in the event. And what we're doing here is we're dynamically grabbing the name of the input that has changed. So if in the square brackets, event.currentTarget.name will get us the name of the input, and providing that we've named that correctly and it's the same as the property on the parent component, we can then set the value to event.target currentTarget.value, and that will be the and that will tell the parent that obviously the value has changed. Okay, we're now going to talk a little bit about our process indicators. These are great little additions that we can add, and if we come back to our flow, we can see that we've put these on quite a lot of our screens, it obviously tells the user how much more they have to proceed within the flow, and lets them know just how long they've got left and where they are in the process, and so on. There are different variants. I like the chevrons, but there's a small issue with this, and if you're going to go use this pattern, you may have to add these to every screen in your flow, and even subflows if you've got those as well. So if then you make a change to that component, you've then got to update an awful lot of flow screens if you're using it in various places. There is an alternative. Before we talk about the alternative, we'll just see how the process indicators are mapped together, because what we're talking about when we talk about stages in a flow is a flow has a stage. So we can set these stages. Our component has two attributes or properties, has a current stage, and it has a number of active stages, and we can set these to these flow variables. And so obviously this is quite useful, and it'll work with multiple different flows, and yeah, it'll work with multiple different flows. However, obviously, if you are going to add these to lots of different screens, then you make changes to the component, then you're going to have to update a lot of the flow screens. There is an alternative to this, and here it is. We then can wrap the flow inside a component. So the screenshot you can see here is a component. So our component here, sitting on side a flow screen, and it's wrapped in a component. So here the top level component has access to the stages within the flow screen and shows us accordingly where we are. If our actions within the flow take us to a subflow, these stages that are active may change because we're in a different flow. But again, we will still be shown where we are in that process. If you're interested to see how you can wrap your flow screen inside a component, then there's a link at the bottom there. There are some design considerations that I've popped down here. So if you are going to create components, you might want to consider whether you make for a single use or whether you make it available for multiple flow screens. Obviously, the more properties or attributes you expose to your flow, potentially the more reusable that component becomes. But likewise, as we've already said, changing that component then may mean that you have to update a lot more of those flow screens. There is a separation of design in terms of the flow and the component. Both can be revised independently. So if your logic changes for your flow, you don't need to worry about changing the component because the component will still function. Likewise, if you need to change some of the UI, maybe you want to use a different process indicator, maybe you're tired of looking at chevrons, then you can obviously change it. They will require different skills and knowledge to maintain each of these, but they can being able to revise them independently is quite a useful benefit. Our next point is essentially around how the flows operate. So when we move from one screen to a next, our governor limits are going to be refreshed. So potentially the flow can handle a number of queries and database updates database updates. And then when we move to a new screen, or in fact, if we have a wait in the flow, the governor limits are going to be refreshed. So we're not going to need to worry about running out of governor limits. The components focus is then entirely on enhancing the UI, and doesn't need to do anything complicated or query the database, etc. Because the flow is going to handle that. And now we've reached the end of the talk. So thanks very much for taking part. If there are any questions, please do get in touch. The Twitter handle is there at the bottom. But thank you very much for your time.
Blockchain can help feed more people. And AI can help care for people. VR can help train people. Let's use technology for people to make a greater good in every community, every day. Accenture. New applied now.